Before Airbnb, widowed composers only had one choice when looking for temporary lodging, which was to rent a haunted house from the local historical society. In The Changeling, George C. Scott does exactly that, and it turns out not to be a very efficient way to write music. On some level, this film is just a classic haunted house movie, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. For one thing, we spend a lot of time outside of the haunted house, and at times it feels more like a political thriller or an archaeological one. There are a couple of interesting inversions in The Changeling. I'm not going to spoil the movie because it's a thriller, and it's a fun movie to watch. This movie is actually pretty scary as things go. Horror movies, perhaps more than any other genre, have a lot of baggage, usually. I'm going to try to spend the majority of this video talking about that baggage, unpacking the personal and cultural trauma that underscores the movie, a lot of which comes to the surface through a child, an uncanny child. This review is going to lean a little bit on the book, The Uncanny Child in Transnational Cinema by Jessica Belanzategui, particularly the first chapter, the only one I read, which talks about The Changeling, The Shining, and Poltergeist, 3 movies from the early 80s, with some similar mechanics around childhood and trauma. Before we get too deep into things, let me tell you that The Changeling came out in 1980, 2 months before The Shining came out, and 2 years before before Poltergeist. It was directed by Peter Medak. Who, you ask? He was mainly a television director, but he made a couple of more notable movies, including Zorro the Gay Blade and The Ruling Class comedies, I think. The movie stars George C. Scott, who is terrific. He strikes a good balance, I think, between dignity and a bit of lunacy. He's a little bit bug-eyed at times, but also wise and shrewd at times. A great role, really kind of fun, but in a serious way. A good horror movie has to have a little bit of fun in it, the way I see it. Trish Van Devere is in the movie too. She was actually married to George C. Scott in real life. At one point in the movie, she called him George instead of John, which is his character's name. This was George's 5th marriage and his 4th wife. He married Colleen Dewhurst twice. Dewhurst's film debut, by the way, was in one of my all-time favorite films, The Nun Story. Melva Douglas is also in The Changeling. It was his penultimate film, and he's terrific. Legendary actor, obviously. I reviewed his phenomenal film, I Never Sang for My Father, on this channel a while ago. Great movie that was written by Robert Anderson, the same guy who wrote The Nun Story. Anyway, The Changeling has a pretty strong cast. It isn't really a serious social drama. It's not a Robert Anderson screenplay, but for what it is, the acting is great. I'll talk a little bit about style and technique, but I want to start at the beginning of the film, I guess. The movie opens up with John and his family coping with a broken down station wagon somewhere on a mountain pass. Don't get too attached to John's family because about a minute into the film, they get run over by a semi-truck. Now, even in this short opening section, there are some interesting details. First, we're introduced to 2 stylistic hallmarks of the film. One is somewhat rapid editing. This movie has a pretty brisk feel to it in general. It uses ellipsis throughout to get straight to the point, to cut from cause to effect, to cut from setup to punchline, leave anything else out. It feels a little bit like some of the edgy, choppy editing of the 70s and late 60s, but here things are maybe a little more stylized, maybe a little bit more generic. Generic in terms of genre, I mean. Maybe things are a little bit less subversive, which might be a theme for the movie overall. The other big style thing is that the camera tends to wander around a bit. It pans across the scene, bringing us slowly over to something significant, or just to the hint of something significant. In the opening, this is used to foreshadow the accident, to show us some of the traffic. Later in the movie, the wandering camera really ratchets up suspense in the house as it kind of forces us to study all the different interior elements, or it lingers on a clue. It lingers on the tape recorder or something like that. Similar to the camera panning around, we also have a lot of surprisingly long shots, long in terms of distance, where we see the action from far away, sometimes with a bit of junk in the foreground, in a way that just suggests that they're being watched or that someone's about to step into the frame or something like that. Later on, when we're in the house, this is, again, another big part of the unsettling feel, seeing things from a distance, looking down the stairwell of the house while the action continues in another room, or looking from the top corner of the ceiling, a place where a human would never find themselves, looking down at what's going on. Big part of the unsettling feel. This is a very suspenseful movie. I think a lot of really suspenseful movies weaponize the senses of the audience. They weaponize the senses of the audiences. They make you afraid to see. They make you afraid to hear. And there's a lot of good examples in this movie in terms of visual style. Like I said, wandering camera forces your eye across things, makes you just think it's about to pan over something spooky. We also get examples in audio. There's a couple of places where you've got to really listen to the movie, where you've got to really turn up the volume to hear something. And you know what's going to happen once you do that. There's also some pretty interesting handheld shots later in this movie, kind of extreme shots of the camera flying around. Again, not a perspective you would really get as a person. This style stuff, like I said, it kind of feels edgy, but it also kind of feels like a Steven Spielberg movie. This movie came out in 1980 and is straddling two very different cinematic and historical eras. We'll talk a bit more about this later. At first, it might seem kind of weird to kill off 2/3 of the family in the opening scene. A lot of horror films depend a little bit on women and children as empathetic engines of the film. This is one of the first inversions that we get in The Changeling. Rather than keeping the family around to subject them to the spooky house, we get rid of them as soon as we've met them. The beginning reminds me a little bit of the beginning of Three Colors Blue, Kieslowski film. That's a movie that looks, I guess, a lot at trauma and trust, the impossibility of isolation and life alone. Very different movie, but some of those themes are here too. I said earlier that this is a movie that's going to be about, in part, some personal trauma. This is the personal trauma, I guess. When the accident first happens, it almost feels a little cheap. It goes by pretty quickly, and the next time we see John, he's moving to Seattle, and seemingly moving on. Like I said, this isn't a social drama that's going to linger on his grieving process. Yet, when he shows up at this haunted house, his accident, his personal tragedy, is going to be somehow linked to some of the ghosts that he's going to have to contend with. It's going to be somehow tied up in the mystery. The danger at the house is a little bit amorphous, and we'll talk about it soon. First, I want to mention that at a high level, this is a film about the dissolution of the family or the corruption of the family unit. In classic Hollywood, basically every movie was the opposite. A movie could only end when a family had been formed, either literally or symbolically. Fast forward a few cynical decades, and things are very different. In the 70s, there's a lot of movies about makeshift families or disintegrating families. This includes horror movies like Don't Look Now or The Exorcist. The myth of the American family was seemingly running out of steam, although the politics of so-called family values were right around the corner. If we do some quick math, we can see that people who were born in 1950 were 18 in 1968, and in 1980 they would have been 30. My father was born in 1950, by the way, and interestingly, actually, the birthday of the ghost in The Changeling is my birthday, just the day, not the year. I'm not that old. And don't worry, that information will not give you access to my bank account. As I was saying earlier, the style of the movie teeters a little bit between something subversive and something more conventional. Partly this is probably down to the commercialization of Hollywood, but this was also a time where America was changing and just getting older, going between phases of life, I guess. A liberated generation was finding themselves with more and more responsibility. I'm not trying to say, this math stuff feels a little simplistic, and I'm not trying to say that everybody was a hippie who suddenly had to put on a tie when 1980 began, but I think it's fair to say that the 80s marked some return to convention, where some of the subversive ideas and symbols of previous decades were subsumed by the commercial landscape. If you were alive at the time, let me know if that's what it was like. I think you can feel that in the style of this movie. Like I said, this sort of teetering between subversive things, and these things just becoming part of the genre, just becoming part of mainstream movies. We see the same thing, I think, with some of the themes in the movie too, actually. The Changeling has hints of colonialism in it, for instance, and hints of political corruption. We even have a nice Watergate-era tape recorder in a major role. The tape recorder gets a lot of scrutiny. In some ways, these things feel poignant and incisive, but in other ways, they kind of just feel like plot devices, like things that you would expect to find in a horror movie, but not things that really matter. So in this sense, maybe it is kind of significant that this movie starts with the end of something, that this movie takes place after everything has already happened, that this movie is backwards looking fundamentally. Introduces us to a time where John is kind of left on his own to navigate this bleak world and somehow try to make peace with the past. I do need to spoil one little thing to really be able to get anywhere in the review. It turns out that the house is haunted by the ghost of a child named Joseph. I'm not going to tell you exactly what happened to Joseph, but I'll say that he isn't exactly a bad guy. He's a somewhat sympathetic character, sort of. A lot of the movie is spent unraveling the story of this child's past, figuring out what happened. Now, kids in horror movies go way back. The vulnerability and emotional salience of children, both physically, personally, and culturally, I guess, makes them ideal for these kinds of movies. The simplest story is one where a child is threatened by something scary. In the 70s, there were a number of high-profile films with a slightly different formula. I'm talking about movies like The Exorcist, The Omen, or Rosemary's Baby, which I know was not from the 70s technically, but whatever. In all these movies, it's a child is possessed by a demon. In some ways, this isn't so different from a child being threatened by a separate entity, but possession narratives really create this clash between something innocent and pure and something evil. Those things inherit the same body, and in some of these movies, you flip between them startlingly. If I review one of those movies, I'll try and dig into a little bit more what we're thinking about there. Don't Look Now, I mentioned earlier, doesn't really fall into this category. If anything, I think that's pretty similar to The Changeling. The Changeling, The Shining, and Poltergeist are all doing something different than The Exorcist. These aren't really possession narratives. The children aren't exactly evil, but they are unsettling, uncanny, you might say. They look onto adults from someplace else. Now, in some ways, all children are unsettling and uncanny. Children are humans, but only sort of, if you know what I mean. I don't want to sound too weird there, but there is a sort of otherness in a child, and sometimes this is tied to acuteness and a quaintness of a child maybe saying the darndest thing or something like that, but there is something just a little unsettling maybe about it too. I hate to do this 2 weeks in a row, but we're talking about stuff that's just going to run straight into a lot of psychoanalysis. First of all, it's clear that this is a movie about repression, be that John's repressed emotions of his family, or the repressed story of Joseph, or the political secrets, or the history of Seattle. These are things that must come to light, it seems. These are secrets that cost us, that are expensive to keep, they're haunting to keep. Some sort of puzzle. There's some kind of puzzle to tease out these moments, and that's what we're doing, as if this entire sort of haunted house experience is one big therapy session enacted, one attempt to tease out these core memories, seemingly from childhood, these moments that are kind of walled off in the attic, that speak only in whispers, and that can be exposed only via a medium. This is psychoanalysis. Freud also had a lot to say about children, the nature of a child, the relationship between an adult and a child. These things are kind of central to his thinking, actually. And it's significant here, not because he was necessarily right about everything, but because this framework for thinking about children is extremely commonplace, penetrated every corner of American culture. One simplistic way to introduce this, I guess, is to think about the inner child, the idea that buried deep inside us, repressed inside us, is a child. In some ways, that's just the past, but in other ways, it isn't. On some level, it doesn't really make any sense to think about this. John's trauma happened to him when he was an adult, yet the movie tangles it up with this kid, Joseph, and the trauma that happened to Joseph as a child long ago. Why is this? Well, maybe because of this Freudian conception of the inner child. Of course, there is a child involved with John's trauma as well, which is his daughter. John takes one of his daughter's toys with him, a ball that he bounces around. Again, think about Don't Look Now, another movie with a ball. And he's sort of comforted by this ball, but also kind of haunted by it. The ball also gets tangled up with Joseph as well. We have this political storyline, too. Questions of political corruption and secrecy are also somehow dredged up by this uncanny childhood. There are hints of colonialism. The child is doing at least double duty, probably more, serving as the site for its own literal traumas, for its own past, but also becoming an ambassador for adult trauma, both of the individual and of society. Everything becomes a crime against the inner child, and this childhood, which is sort of in the past, but also very current, ends up speaking for a huge amount of kind of bundled emotions and problems. There's a wound, and this inner child becomes something incredibly unstable. Even though Joseph has no corporeal existence, he can blow open the doors of the house. He can sabotage John's compositions. It's a great little plot line in the film when John thinks he has composed an original melody, only to find out that he's actually written one of Joseph's old lullabies. This uncanny child is always kind of with us and floating around, ready to meddle in our lives, to poke at us from the inside and such. Again, I'm not saying that any of this is necessarily good psychology, but correct or not, Freud had a big influence here, and this movie seems like a pretty good example of a certain type of thought about children, a certain way that children and adults are linked, and it is a departure in some ways from some of the possession narratives from the films from the 70s that I was mentioning earlier. Furthermore, you have The Shining and you have Poltergeist doing very similar things, movies from a very similar time, which is interesting. It's hard to prove that this trope was really unique to the 80s, but maybe some of the cultural tumult that I mentioned earlier, as well as some of the commercialization of childhood happening, maybe the rise of family values, maybe these things could sort of spin up this particular salience of the uncanny child. A few final notes. First of all, Don't Look Now. I've said it before, but this is really quite a similar movie. I have a few other comparisons that might seem pretty unhinged, but I think they make sense. First, there's the movie Ordinary People, which came out, I think, in the same year. It also involves the dissolution of a family, and in that film, a neglected child, again, sort of speaks for this intergenerational trauma in some ways. There's no ghosts involved, but I think it's kind of in similar territory. And yeah, to understand this idea of the uncanny child, and why that may have been particularly salient at this moment, maybe it's a good idea to look beyond the supernatural films. I'm not sure that uncanny children are necessarily limited to supernatural films. Another movie that's in the ballpark is Dead Poet Society. That's from the end of the 80s, but it's another story about repression, and it's another story told somewhat in the whispers of a neglected child. So crimes against an inner child. So anyway, that's interesting. Like I said, a lot of this was sort of, some of it was inspired a bit by this book, and you might consider checking it out if you're interested in this. This video is maybe a little more on the analytical side, maybe, I don't know. Overall, The Changeling is a really fun movie to watch, and obviously, you don't really need to tell me that. There's plenty of reviews of it. So hopefully I struck at some slightly more interesting things about this movie, which, yeah, overall I would recommend both to sort of watch and also to think about it. Pretty cool movie. So that's The Changeling.